and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon, and we are continuing our series tearing apart this book, Ancient Egyptian Magic by Eleanor Harris. Today we're talking about levels of priesthood and the garb that they wore. Fun fact for you, Elizabeth Taylor in the movie Cleopatra had the most costume changes of any actor or actress in any movie anywhere. I think it was somewhere over 300. I actually sat down to try to count them once and I lost count. Why is that relevant? Because we're going to be talking about the different kinds of garb that priests wore, what's represented in this book, and what would actually be more practical. So I'm going to be doing my own Elizabeth Taylor, if you will, and we'll be demonstrating a few of them as we go along. But to start, on page 22 through 23, she gives a list of priestly titles, which, unfortunately, it's going all in the wrong direction. They're all, she says, the following 10 examples demonstrate an ancient Egyptian priesthood that is known to have performed funeral ceremonies. And the Herihob, that was the lector priest. She doesn't bother to mention that. That was the one who read from the scroll. They were involved in a lot of things, and it's thought that the Herihob priests were a lot of your magicians. The Sem, it's funny, she says, a priest whose function is not entirely known. Actually, we know a decent amount about the Sem priest, and I'll get to them in a minute. But the Samer and Sameref, the beloved, son or the friend, again, these are folks who would have played roles in a funeral. Same, and now the Shedar, who represented Isis and Nephthys, this was in the Osiris Mysteries. And some of the other things that are listed in here, again, funerals do not represent the entirety of Egyptian religion. If you really want a good idea of what were some ancient Egyptian priesthood types, for one, you can always check out one of my books, Circle of the Sun, on page 194. I give you a list of historical priest roles and descriptions, and they're much longer than hers. But also another good book that, has very similar information in it, and I have lots of bookmarks in it because we're going to be referring to it, Religion and Ritual in Ancient Egypt by Emily Teeter. And she's a real Egyptologist, and she gives some really good information in here, and it's current, unlike the other book. One thing to remember is that the priesthood in ancient Egypt, at least in the temples, was very hierarchical. Because remember, it was a type of bureaucracy. And so you had a bottom level and you could theoretically work your way up to a higher position. Starting on page 20 of Religion and Ritual in Ancient Egypt, you have the Wab priest, and literally that is a pure one. That was your basic role, and they were in charge of handling ritual vessels and stuff like that. If you think about it in a modern context, a Wab priest would be in charge of things like cleaning out your incense burners, making sure you have fresh candles, making sure that all of the ritual implements are ready. They have to be pure in order to handle these things, but they're not the ones that actually conduct the rituals. They're not the ones that are reading from the texts, and they're actually in front of the statues. In ancient times, they were not allowed into the inner sanctum. However, they were involved in carrying the litters, the portable shrines that the deity statues were in for festivals. What's interesting is, Dr. Emily Teeter here says, this rank of priest wore no distinguishing dress or hairstyle. And actually there were several classes of priests that, you really couldn't tell just by what they were wearing, if they were really looking any different from other folks. We do know that ancient Egyptian priests tended to wear things that were plain and fairly archaic, even for ancient Egyptian standards. So to understand that, when you're looking at pictures of tomb paintings and funerary monuments and things like that, you have to do a little bit of interpreting and think about what are they showing here, because someone who was a priest might not represent themselves in their priest robes on a family monument. You know, that would be like today seeing a family's Olin Mills photograph, portrait, and thinking that that's what people wore to work or to school. No, everybody got in their nice clothes for that. And I got stuffed into dresses I really hated for those kind of pictures, because I hated dresses when I was little. So, you know, you can't judge something like that for, you know, what people were wearing when they were on the job. Same thing with priests. In order to get an idea of that, you have to look for depictions of festivals and things like that, where you would see priests performing their roles and in their proper dress. So what was the basic garb of a Wab priest? A plain white robe. Or if you want to use modern parlance, a kaftan. You can look for those online. Or you can make one yourself. People have also called this a muumuu, a sundress. Basically, just a plain white robe. Here you are ready to perform as a Wab priest. There were a couple of types of servant or hem priests. One was actually called the hem ka, a servant of the ka. Their job was to officiate at a family's tomb, and there would be endowments set up for them so that, you know, a portion of the family's holdings would support them. And so imagine you want to make sure that someone goes and officiates at, you know, your mother and father's tomb for all the holidays, but you can't do that because you're too busy managing the estate. Well, you set up somebody to go and do that for you, and that's their job. And when they die, their child and their son inherits that position. In the Old Kingdom, that's what they did. And hey, what a way to make a living, right? Now, according to this book, they didn't really have any special dress that set them apart from other ancient Egyptians. You know, I suspect that they weren't showing up to work in the equivalent of, you know, t-shirt and cargo pants, but but they didn't have any special dress. So, you know, it was probably just a plain white, you know, kaftan, as we would call it today. The other type of hem priest is the hem netcher, which many of you are probably familiar with. That means the servant of the god. They actually had higher rank than the hem ka priests did, and they did have at least plain robes that were specific to the priesthood. Now, among the hem netcher, it seems to me that that was like the main bulk of the priestly staff at a temple, were hem netcher priests. And, or perhaps, you know, Wab, and then, you know, the lower ranks of the hem netcher. That would have been most of your folks. And there were varying ranks of hem netcher. And then you had the top ones, and over them you'd have the imiu or the tepi hem netcher, the ones who would have been over the other ones, the overseers of the priests. So what did the hem netcher priests wear? What do you know? A plain white robe. I think I see a trend. From what we can tell with temple reliefs, they probably had a specific cut of garment that was archaic compared to the more stylish plain linen clothes that stylish Egyptians wore when they weren't on duty. But today, if you wanted to differentiate yourself, if you have more than one person performing a ritual and you have enough people that you can have a hem netcher and a wub and, you know, a couple of other people acting different parts, one way that you can distinguish yourself is with a colored sash or a bead rosary that can act as the insignia for the deity that you're serving. This is just one example. This is the color that I had. This could go for Bast or for Wajid or for Sekhmet, or a lot of people like to use red for Sekhmet. You know, there's no set rule of, colors, this color goes to this deity, but there are a lot of trends you can find by, looking at artwork. Green seems to be favored by Bast. A lot of people who do artwork of Bast use green, so, that sort of thing can give you an idea, and this would be a way to distinguish, priests for specific purposes. And the Herihob, and it's spelled typically as Kheri or Y, but it's one of those particular H sounds in ancient Egyptian, so it's Kheri, like the corresponding sound in Arabic and Hebrew. That is most commonly translated as the lector priest, but those are the ones that knew the spells and that knew the literature. It literally means, one who is over the book. And so that's what they would be doing. They would be reading from the scrolls, yes, at funerals, but also at other functions. And because they knew all of these, corpus of writings, they were often the ones who were consulted when spells were needed. They had a very particular type of insignia of rank that you also see in any depiction of Jehuti, because Jehuti is the archetypical Herihob. If you think of it, he is the Herihob of the gods. And so that white sash, that Keni stole that he wears, is their insignia. It's a bit harder to see because it's white on white, but this is the Keni stole of a Herihob priest. That would be the lector priest who is actually reading from the sacred texts. And this is, it shows up much more easily, obviously, against a bare chest. And if you notice any artwork of Jehuti, that's what he's wearing, because that's his insignia, and anyone who acts as a reader is performing his role. Now, what about those Sem priests? We actually do know enough about them to kind of want to ask more questions. That's a role that goes back to the earliest periods of Egyptian history. And they're not only involved in funerals, because those are the ones that you see performing the opening of the mouth. Probably the most famous example that people would think of is that scene from Tutankhamun's tomb, where Ai is acting as the Sem, and he's also acting as, the loving son to Tutankhamun, who in this case ritually is representing Osiris, as his son Horus. There's a lot of symbolism in that, but also he's wearing the leopard sash that is the Sem priest's main insignia. Now, it seems that the Sem priest had a decent amount of rank, and there was one attached to every temple. If you read in the Calendars of Ancient Egypt by Richard Parker, which is available from the University of Chicago's website, when he describes the list of days in an Egyptian month, one of the days is the going forth of the Sem priest. So there seems to be something significant to that, and we think that there may have been trance-like states that were, part of the Sem's, roles, but we don't quite know for sure. So there's a lot of intriguing elements to that, but we know that that was, a major figure in, the world of the Egyptian priesthood. Now, there is a story behind the leopard print stole that they wear. It goes to a document that it's now called the Papyrus Umilhag, and there's a story in there where Set takes on the form of a leopard in order to try to desecrate the body of Osiris, which is hidden. Well, Anubis stops him and brands him with an iron, and that's where the leopard spots comes from. That's the Egyptian version of the Just So story of how the leopard got his spots, is because Anubis branded him with an iron, and he took on that hide as his, as an emblem, to, suggest, the protection of Osiris and, the keeping Set's hostility at bay. Now, there is another type of priesthood that also wore a leopard stole, and it was with a few accoutrements. This was a type of priest that was called the chief of seers. That's how they translate it now. I believe the Egyptian term was urmao, the great seer, one who sees. And in the past that's been translated as like a prophet. But that doesn't really fit. It sounds too Judeo-Christian. That's not what it meant. This was someone who saw the gods. So this was a very high-ranking priest. Now, in the Heliopolis tradition and in that complex, the chief of seers wore a leopard stole that had stars on it. And it seems that knowledge of astronomy was a part of their purview. And we all know what this is. This is the leopard stole that was worn by a Sem priest or by the urmao, the chief of seers in Heliopolis, or in Thebes acting as the southern counterpart. Of course, this is not cut like an actual leopard hide, which is what was worn in ancient times, and it had a carved leopard head that would have sat right about at the belt line. And actually, when I was making this one, I thought for a moment of cutting it in that shape, but I remember actually it was Darren who said, no, that would look too kooky, just make it a straight sash. And that's what most people tend to go for. But I do have to say, guys, you only need the leopard print if you are trying to officiate in the capacity of a Sem priest or the chief priest in a given temple. And if you look at the reliefs depicting festivals, and you had the rows of priests, out of 5 or 6 rows, only 1 or 2 of them would have been the priest wearing the leopard robes. Those would have been the ones acting in very specific capacities. Now there was also a couple of levels of priest who wore a side lock, which is a braid on the side of their head. And it's associated with the side lock of youth. I think that's what, most scholars say, oh, well, it's like what a child would wear. And in certain ritual contexts, yes, that's appropriate because, especially when they are wearing the leopard hide and then having the side braid, they're acting in the role of Horus as pillar of his mother or defender of his father, in performing rites for Osiris. But I think there may have been another significance to it that's included in one of the spells that originated in the coffin texts and carried through to the Book of the Dead. I'll read it for you. Okay, this is spell 115, for ascending to the sky, opening up the tomb, and knowing the souls of Heliopolis, also known in Egyptian as Yanu. I have spent yesterday among the great ones. I have become Capri. I have cleared the vision of the soul eye. I have opened up the circle of darkness. I am one of them. I know the souls of Heliopolis, into which the high priest of Heliopolis was not initiated through revelation. I know the hostile acts by him who would destroy the heirs of Heliopolis. I know why a braided lock is made for a man. Ra disputed with the serpent, he who is in his burning, and his mouth was injured, and that is how the reduction in the month came about. He said to the serpent, I will take my harpoon which men will inherit, and that is how the harpoon came into being. The serpent said, the 2 sisters will come into being, and that is how Ra's passing came into being. There's some... We still don't know what all of that is referring to, but I think it's only a matter of time before it all clicks and makes sense. So, it so happened that he of the red cloth heard, and his arm was not stopped. He transformed himself into a woman with braided hair, and that is how the priest of Heliopolis with braided hair came into being. It so happened that the mighty one was stripped in the temple, and that is how the stripped one of Heliopolis came into being. It so happened that the heritage of the air came into being, and great will be he who shall see it. He will become high priest of Heliopolis. So there's a story here that involves the conflict between Ra and the evil serpent. And somewhere in the midst of this, someone made a braid, and there's a reference in one of the coffin texts where that was meant as a ruse. And so it almost suggests somebody, going in drag. But I think that some of the priests who had a sidelock wore it in reference to that myth. So actually, there have been times when I've done rituals for, execration and, to subdue the serpent, where I've actually braided my hair in the back, and it's in reference to that myth. So talking about priestly garb and some of the modern practicalities of that, there are a few more things that I want to point out. For one, I'm going to borrow a page from my Native American friends, because when people go to powwows, and I've been to a few of them, and I actually have a little bit of powwow regalia, that's what I was going to talk about, we never refer to it as a costume or, dress up or anything like that. The word they specifically use is regalia, because what we're wearing when we get in circle is not a costume. This is garb that is often very specific to tribes. There are certain things that particular tribes wear that others don't, and it all has a meaning, and it's not play, it's not pretend we're, there for a reason. And I think we should keep that consideration in mind when we're talking about actual religious garb, because we're not playing, I would hope. There's a difference between wearing an emis to go to a convention versus wearing, robes for a ceremony. So I think calling it either regalia or garb would be more appropriate, and never refer to it as just a costume. One other piece of regalia that I do not see mentioned anywhere in pagan books or by other Egyptian pagans is actually another piece of insignia that was used by the chief of seers in Heliopolis, or Unu, and that is a beaded drop apron, or it's referred to in the pyramid texts, where I saw it translated as a malachite sporin. Now, if you look up sporin, they're actually talking about those little fur things that the Scots would wear in the front of their kilt. But same basic idea. And if you look on statues of men who officiated as a chief of seers in Heliopolis, or in the southern Heliopolis, being in Thebes, for example, the very famous statue of Annen, who was the brother of Queen Tia, he is wearing the leopard print stole and a beaded sporin, which is not colored in the statue, at least there's no paint surviving on it, but given the context from the pyramid texts, we can assume that it was made of malachite, and this actually has genuine malachite beads along with glass and pendants on it. The reason why I wear these together, for one, the stole of the head priest of Unu in Heliopolis, that is the tradition that I identify with the most. I'm a Leo. I have a lot of strong solar associations. My patrons are Ra and Sekhmet, and also, Tutankhamun being, born and raised in, the city of Aten, he has a strong connection to that as well. In fact, in his cartouche, his title was ruler of southern Heliopolis. So they were stressing that solar aspect. So being the one to restart the tradition, as it were, I took this on first, and also to reflect what I do as a teacher when I get on YouTube and explain things. That's what I'm doing. And this is, this was a more recent addition. I, hesitated for a long while before I added this, but what made me decide to do it was actually doing the videos, was actually doing the live services, because I have other people that are participating, and I have some folks who are occasionally acting as assistants, so I figured it was an appropriate thing to do. But what I would suggest for anyone if you're going to, especially if you're an independent and you're trying to, you know, come up with ritual garb for yourself, whatever you do, make sure that there's meaning behind the different pieces that you choose and that it's something relevant to what you're doing. So this is actually my full ensemble whenever I'm officiating. And I wear the Kani stole of a Herihob because, well, actually I was encouraged to do so after I started writing my last book. It's as if someone was telling me, hey, you're writing, you're putting all this stuff together, you're kind of acting in that capacity, so go ahead and put that on. So, okay. And as for the leopard head that was part of the Sem and the Chief Seer's robe, nowadays what a lot of people seem to be doing is getting these little leopard heads from craft stores. This one was actually a gift from Yamanu, and so I'm often hesitant to add a new piece to my regalia because, you know, I want to make sure that it's something that has a legitimate purpose and that it's time, it's appropriate. And because this was given to me, I said, well, I guess that's kind of a sign that I need to put it on. Hopefully this gives you a very good visual idea of priestly garb and what works and what might be going a little overboard. Again, next time we'll be talking about the Greek magical papyri. In the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful Samhain, Halloween. The Koyak mysteries are coming up. We'll be celebrating that, you know, in our weekly service. And also because, you know, Halloween's on a Saturday and it's really tempting. It's going to be tough for me because I like having trick-or-treaters on Halloween, but this year's going to have to be different. And I'm thinking of hosting something in the backyard, and, you know, we can all stay in and stay safe for Halloween. But in the meantime, I hope everyone stays well, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. So until then, Synapti.
Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com and shop for pagan supplies in my Etsy store. Check the description for links. And special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Join us for updates, outtakes, and exclusive videos only on Patreon.